Pokemon without weaknesses aren't really a thing anymore. But even when they were, they kind of sucked. Which feels weird, right? You'd think Pokemon with literally no type weaknesses would be top tier, or at least really strong. At least that's what I thought, before I used every single one of them, and was pretty disappointed. They weren't exactly bad, but for Pokemon with literally no weaknesses, you'd expect something more, especially defensively. So what went wrong? Was it a fundamental flaw, or just mediocre design? Let's find out. Our cases are very few and far between. We have Sableye, Spiritomb, and by extension of an ability, Eelektross. Sableye is a Pokemon sporting horrible stats. Not off to the best start, with the base stat total of 380. For context, that's slightly worse than a middle evolution starter. And it's not distributed any better either, having 75 defense and 65 special defense, on top of 50 HP. Don't worry, its offenses aren't any better either, being the same as their defensive counterparts on both sides. It is, however, completely immune to fighting, normal, and psychic moves, and resists poison moves as well. But I'm afraid that's where the positives end. It's neutral to everything else, has no noteworthy ability, at least not yet, which didn't help at all in making its no weaknesses actually matter. This Pokemon was still a slog, be it in its debut region, Generation 4, or Generation 5, when it still had its title of a Pokemon with no weaknesses. Generation 3 allowed you to get Sableye as early on as before the second gym in Granite Cave. This meant it was actually pretty balanced for its base stats, and you could use its fighting immunity against Brawly. Pretty good start, and you could also bring him back against Norman not too long after. But you're just sabotaging yourself if you're using this Pokemon for anything else, especially when you start entering late game after beating Norman. The stats alone make it hard for Sableye to keep up, and no physical special split alongside its mediocre moveset only cemented this Pokemon as just mid. I mean, its best stab was Shadow Ball and Feint Attack, and it wasn't exactly a good support Pokemon yet either. It had no real role or purpose. Its weak defenses made it hard to use as a tank despite having no weaknesses, and its weak offenses made it hard to use in general against regular trainers. It was a super niche Pokemon only really good against Brawly, and maybe Norman, as it couldn't really make use of its zero weaknesses to stay in and dish out damage, or stay in and tank a couple of hits either. Generation 4 introduced the physical special split, already helping out Sableye a ton. But that wasn't the only improvement. It also got a better move pool, allowing the use of Shadow Sneak and Punishment as physical stab moves now. But not being its debut region, you have to go through some hoops to get this Pokemon. Either through trading or using a dual slot with Sapphire and Diamond Pearl or Platinum, or in a Route 9 Swarm and Heart Gold, which at that point in time also comes up with the same flaws as in Generation 3. Too little too late. Its actual no weaknesses won't help with those base defenses at this point in the game. In Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum, you only get to use this Pokemon for Byron and onward. Definitely no help there. And in Heart Gold, Route 9 is in Kanto. Need I say more? But even if you were to get Sableye early, it would only somewhat contribute against Maylene and Whitney, albeit barely. Generation 5 is also convoluted in its use cases, being only available post-game in Black and White, and only through a trade as the female character in Black and White 2. It's also a really weird process to trade in from previous generations with the Poke Transfer Lab, but let's say you do. It helps against Lenora in Black and White. It does have its typing advantage against the Elite Four, but stats alone kill its usability, barely able to take a hit and retaliate. That is, until the Prankster ability, greatly boosting usability through support such as Priority Will-O-Wisps. But that's mostly relevant for competitive formats. It isn't worth the hassle for regular playthroughs. Throughout the regions, its only usability came from its immunities, rather than its lack of weaknesses. But before coming to conclusions, let's visit the other two Pokemon. Spiritomb is definitely a massive improvement, coming in with some pretty usable stats at the very least. Although the same base HP and even lower speed, it has fairly high defenses and even offenses, sporting a pretty good moveset too, all things considered. It's no wonder it's an addition to the Champions team. Even so, it is one of our weaker mons, and you can definitely feel it if you've tried using it in a playthrough. A big reason why being the weaker HP and speed stat. Without setup, its best role is delegated to being a support or taking down a single Pokemon in most cases. It's not hard to prevail against one, but by the time you get the KO, you're probably low and die to any hit. This can be mitigated through rest and sleep talk, but that's a pretty big detour for barely a sizable performance upgrade taking up 2 move slots. It's available from the infamous Odd Keystone, providing great help melee and onward. It's a solid addition to a team, don't get me wrong. If it's able to take down at least one Pokemon in most cases, it already shows its value. But when it's a Pokemon with no weaknesses, you'd expect a little more than a generalist good Pokemon. If I were to put it on a tier list, it would be an A tier Pokemon. Good, but there are definitely way better ones out there that provide a lot more value. Have you been noticing it? The lack of value having no weaknesses provides? It's a nice baseline, granting Pokemon more general usability if anything, allowing it to not be barred from any fight or part of the game, but it is still an uphill battle to remain competitive against top tier Pokemon. Generation 5 only let you get Spiritomb through the Dream World in Black and White, or a trade from Curtis or Yancey in Black and White 2. At least it wasn't locked to a single gender. Its slight stat upgrades do help it remain competitive even late game, providing value against the Elite Four by accomplishing what Sableye tried to do. But again, that's mostly attributed to its immunities rather than its lack of weaknesses. We'll come back to this later. Even competitively, it was outshadowed by the Rotom forms in what role Spiritomb was trying to accomplish. Eelektross is also about the same tier as Spiritomb, good for regular playthroughs but nothing game-changing. It has 85 base HP, a lot higher than the other two, with defenses taking a middle ground at 80 for both, and offenses at the forefront with 115 attack and 105 special attack. But like the other two, it is a slow Pokemon. Not that big of a deal, having decent defenses, but the only problem is, it's pretty late game. Tynum was available at Chargestone Cave, but you'll only really have an Eelektross available after level 39, which is about when you reach Bryson, the 7th gym in Black and White, and Skyla, the 6th gym in Black and White 2. It's alright, but there's only so much help it can provide from this point onward, especially when you have access to a lot of other really strong Pokemon, with fierce competition for a slot on most teams. For when you get Eelektross, its typing doesn't really offer anything special in Black and White, but in Black and White 2, it does have a massive advantage over Skyla and Marlin. Other than that, it's just a solid Pokemon. Arguably worse than Spiritomb for the generalist position. It's usable everywhere, but doesn't stand out anywhere, having mediocre resistances and immunity to ground moves alone. Even competitively, it was far too frail and slow to be offensive for most tiers. Like our previous cases, where do most of its positives come from? The resistances and advantages of the electric type, not the lack of weaknesses. Its strength against Skyla comes from resisting flying moves and being able to retaliate with super effective electric moves, and the strength against Marlin comes from super effective electric moves alone. It having no weaknesses doesn't exactly give it that much of a use case. It only negates disadvantageous situations, allowing being neutral as a generalist Pokemon at worst. But is it really that impressive? When most teams are already made up of diverse types that cover for weaknesses against different trainers and parts of the game? Rather than strength, it's really just convenience. The absence of a downside isn't the same as having an upside. Just because you're not being punished doesn't mean you're being rewarded. If any of these 3 Pokemon are your favorite, this helps prevent them from being barred from any section of the game. But that's about it. This supposed advantage doesn't exactly elevate the Pokemon. And if the best these Pokemon have to offer is being an average jack of all trades, they probably weren't all that strong to begin with. So if not for a lack of weaknesses, what exactly makes a Pokemon good defensively? You may have noticed that most of these Pokemon's advantages still came from their resistances and immunities rather than the lack of disadvantages. Pokemon is a game fundamentally about making the most out of typings, rather than trying to minimize a Pokemon's weaknesses. A key factor to be taken into account is maximizing the resistances a Pokemon can offer. Offensively, this doesn't matter nearly as much. Many Pokemon can learn moves outside their type to provide coverage, but defensively, innate typings are key, which is why Steel Pokemon in particular are known for their defensive utility. Although having notable weaknesses, they provide a plethora of resistances, particularly against many common offensive types. This helps defensive utility and survival far more than general neutrality against a larger spread of Pokemon encounters in regular playthroughs. Pokemon like Magnezone, despite even having a 4x weakness, is considered a great defensive Pokemon, resisting more than half of the type chart, including some of the most common offensive types throughout Pokemon. So rather than shying away from Pokemon that have glaring weaknesses such as Magnezone to ground or Swampert to grass, in favor of Pokemon with the least amount of weaknesses, try maximizing resistances while balancing your team to cover for the weaknesses of each other. Magnezone facing off against a ground type? Bring in Staraptor. Tyranitar about to eat a fighting type move? Bring in that Sableye. Not for its lack of weaknesses, but for its immunity. Pokemon has been, and always will be, about types. Embrace it and use it to your advantage, because clearly, shying away from it isn't as good as it might sound. Especially when Mega Sableye held such a dominant presence even after gaining a weakness, all from its raw stats alone.